So my name is Napoleon-Kuofie, and I'm a senior BI analyst at Farfetch. And I wanted to just say thank you for coming and listening to my talk, because I know testing is not necessarily the most glamorous subject in the world. And actually, when I actually applied to speak at Coalesce, I had two talks in mind. So one of them was about testing, and the other one was about deploying models using Airflow. And when I was speaking to the DBT team, what we landed on and why we landed on testing was because the ideas that I'm going to talk about today are, I think, easier to understand, and also they're easier to implement. But with that, you get a greater benefit from it for your business and your organization. The talk aims to help with the following challenges that we have at Farfetch, and I'm guessing a few of you will have or will have in the future. So if your number of models are increasing rapidly, which we're finding, it's hard to keep a handle on making sure that everything's accurate. If you're spending a lot of time investigating data inconsistencies, at Farfetch, we've spent, I can say, countless hours investigating data inconsistencies. So hopefully today I can sort of give you some techniques to help reduce those hours. Having frequent issues with source data, I think that's just the nature of data. At source, there can be problems, and we're going to talk about how we try to address that as well. And also, finally, stakeholders scrutinizing your reports. So I think this is actually a good thing, because if they're looking at your reports, it's a positive thing, and it means that they actually care about the data and the insights you're driving. But also it means that you have to be really on top of making sure that these numbers are correct and accurate. So before I dive into the main part of my talk, I just wanted to cover who's Farfetch and what we do. So Farfetch is a global luxury fashion platform, which provides a platform for boutiques and brands to sell to consumers. And what we do is we provide the platform, and then we take a commission based on every single order. And we have 2.1 billion GMV, which is like a revenue number in 2019, 5,000 employees, 2.7 million active customers, and the average order value of a customer is between $500 and $600. And we ship globally to 190 plus countries. Within my team, which looks after marketing and private client, just as a heads up, private client are our VIP customers that spend over $10,000 a year with us. And with that, they get their own personal stylist. So we have to create more granular data so the stylist can really understand their client and maximize the relationship with them. In the marketing and private client org, there's 200 plus stakeholders, and that's sort of growing daily. And within my team, we have 6 BI analysts or analytics engineers. And through our journey with using DBT, we've created over 350 models, and that is continually growing. So the focus of today is testing, and I wanted to highlight my thoughts on testing first of all, and I guess how it evolved over time. And then I want to discuss Farfetch's journey of testing, where we've been and where we are now, and why we believe it's better. And then lastly, I would like to give you some recommendations for you to go forth and implement within your team. So firstly, let's get the obvious out of the way. Testing is super important and super valuable. However, I would say I was naive at first when it came to testing. So when you build a model, you're doing your sort of tests live before you do a deployment. So you're checking if there's duplicates, you're making sure that the numbers make sense. And because you're sort of doing that over maybe 2-3 years worth of data, you kind of go, yep, those are the tests, those checks, tick, 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 and then you deploy. And then sometimes testing is like an afterthought, or at least it was for me, because I just assumed that because I've checked that the data was fine, it's always going to be fine. And with my experience, you can definitely see that doesn't happen. Secondly, I think it's also possible to look like you're doing testing and you're actually not really doing effective testing. So an example of this is saying, oh, this field should never be null, which again, a valid test, but in reality, how many times have you experienced it where the field is null and it's made a massive error in your calculations or whatever you're doing downstream? And also, I think it's easy to overdo it. So if you start thinking about all the things that can go wrong, you start creating almost too many tests, and you're not necessarily thinking about the threshold of why a test should fire or should fail. And then you can get lost in the noise of too many tests. And I think I've had that as well, where the list of tests that are firing off as a failure is almost overwhelming, and then you end up not actually doing anything to fix it. So with that, I think it's crucial to test the right things and to be really crystal clear on what is important to the business and make sure that at least you get those things correct. So how did we start at Farfetch? So I think before we didn't really have a great testing strategy in general. And then when we moved to DBT, because of how easy and simple it is to implement, we started being like, yes, this is really cool. We can actually start doing tests. So we started putting tests on pretty much everything. But I would say the tests that we were doing were on the more trivial side of things. So as I said before, things as, is this data not null? Very easy to do in DBT. Should this field contain what values? Again, a valid test, I think also really easy to do within DBT with the out-of-the-box functions. And then obviously testing primary keys is a super important test. But even with that, we still encountered issues going forward. So I'm not saying do not do these tests. I think you should do them. They're quite easy to do, but I think there's another layer to go. So why did we change our approach? So the main reason was out of a place of frustration. So stakeholders would actually constantly message us saying that the data is looking wrong, it's looking inaccurate. Could you please check, verify that it's right? And what happened was we spent hours and hours and hours just checking if there was a discrepancy. And more times than none, it might not actually be an issue, that the data was fine. They maybe applied the wrong filter. But again, we still had to go through the process of doing our due diligence to understand if the data is correct. And that took lots of time. It was actually quite frustrating, sort of coming in at like 9 o'clock in the morning and then getting a load of messages to verify if data is correct when you had many other plans during your day. And also, thirdly, to understand, we needed to have a way to keep our data engineering team accountable as well, because ultimately we're getting the data from them and then we're flowing it through our process to get an output for our stakeholders to view. And I think there was a bit of disconnect with us in the team, that we're dependent on them and our stakeholders are dependent on us. And through testing, I think we've managed to make this relationship stronger and like us a bit more interconnected. So what do we do now? So we focus on 3 things, which I'm going to cover in more detail. So the first one, what are your essential metrics? What are the things in your business that you need to get right? And if someone says there is an issue with it, it's like all hands on deck. We need to figure out what went wrong. And I think these metrics are different for every single business. So for example, it could be about how many active customers you have, what is your revenue, how many visits are you getting to the website or app, for example. Then secondly, what is the does the dimensional mix make sense? So we're not thinking about, oh, does this field have the right name? We're thinking about, is the percentage correct for the different value types? And then thirdly, which I think is something that we've overlooked for some time, is that is your data remaining consistent over time? Because I imagine multiple teams are just doing full refreshes on their data, and you don't necessarily know if you're overriding that data. And also potentially you're overriding it for a right reason, but someone else has actually looked at the data and thinks, why has it changed? So we'll go into detail about that. So number one, what are your essential metrics? And for Farfetch, one of our essential metrics is GTV, which is gross transactional value. And this is a revenue number. So a lot of our stakeholders have a GTV target that they need to hit monthly. And one of the things that happened with us is that we would get a message in the morning, typically saying the GTV number looks wrong. And then with that, the first thing we go is, what do you mean it looks wrong? And then the conversation will evolve into the number's either too high or it's too low. And after that, that sparks, I guess, the mad rush of trying to figure out, is this number actually correct or not? And the way we were doing it is we'll go to the main report, look at that GTV number, assess, okay, is it high or is it too low? Okay, maybe they have a point. Then you're going back through the chain to the next model and understanding, has the GTV changed from this model to this model? And then if it's not, then you keep on going back and you keep on going back until you probably end at the source data. And then if the source data is wrong, you're having a different conversation where you're trying to get data engineering involved to understand, why is this number wrong? Is it something on our side that we haven't pulled through correctly? So it's quite a sort of painful process going back and back through the chain. And also, I think it's a bad starting point when your stakeholder is pointing out that something is wrong. So what we've done at Farfetch is we've implemented tests at each part of the chain. So from this staging model to this staging model, does GTV flow and is it exactly the same? Then at this stage, does it flow and is it exactly the same? And all the way through. And then if there's a point where the GTV number changes, we get a Slack notification to let us know. And then that allows us to quickly come in and investigate and pinpoint exactly where the issue lies so we can go in to fix it, rather than going through all the different chains, which can take so much time. Another thing that happens is that a stakeholder will come to us and say, here's GTV in this report, but in, say, the commercial report, the number's different. And then that's another challenge where we have to think, okay, I need to investigate, why is GTV different here versus GTV here? And again, that's a difficult process where you have to loop in multiple people to understand what's the issue. So one thing we're really, I guess, hot on at Farfetch is trying to build the source of truth, which I imagine a lot of you guys are facing challenges with. So now we have a sort of central table where GTV is calculated for us. And what happens is the organization is supposed to help themselves to that GTV calculation. And with that, now we have our source of truth. We just flow our data. And then once we know we're confident that our GTV is correct, it's easier to have a chat with the commercial team saying, have you checked the source of truth? Your numbers are different to ours. What could it be? It could be, and also it could be a legitimate reason. Maybe there's a filter that is intentionally added, for example. So I think with this, it's just made it so much easier to troubleshoot and also to be on the front foot when an issue arises, because we can just quickly see and pinpoint and also let our stakeholders know we're on it, rather than them chase us saying what's going on with the data. Second, does the dimensional mix make sense? So on the chart on the right-hand side, you can see our paid revenue and non-paid, and then there's an on-track bucket. Again, this is just like an example split. And with this, we face some challenges. So what we have at Farfetch is we have a central table that gives us all our orders. And then to understand the marketing channel that someone came through to place an order, we use third-party data. So that's GA and AppsFlyer. And what's happened in the past is that the AppsFlyer data has partially updated. So we've only had 12 hours worth of data. So our sensor has picked up the data and said, yep, let's go, let's do the processing. And with that, you've only got 12 hours worth of data. What happens is where the orders from the app model can't join, we just assign it in the catch bucket into untracked. So on a couple of occasions, that untracked bucket has become larger because of incomplete data. And then again, our stakeholder will message us saying, oh, for the display channel, our ROI is crazy low, or yeah, the GTV number looks so much lower than usual. And then again, that will spark some investigation of what's going on. We need to figure it out. So with this, does the dimensional mix make sense? What we've done is we've created a test that allows us to understand what that mix should be. So typically we expect the untracked bucket to be about 10%. So if the number is, say, greater than 15% of untracked, that will flag a warning to us to go check our data. So the first things we'll do is check, is the Google Analytics data fully up to date? Is the AppsFlyer fully up to date? Is there something else going on? And again, I think it helps us to be more proactive with our stakeholders, because we can go and tell them, it looks like the AppsFlyer data is partially complete. Therefore, I wouldn't trust those numbers, but we're looking into it. We're going to refresh the data. We'll let you know when it's good to use, rather than them coming to us and telling us that the data looks wrong. Then third, I think this is super important, is your data consistent over time? So when you check Monday's data on Wednesday, say your cost is 10 million, and then when you check Monday's cost on Friday and it goes up to 11 million, is that a valid thing? Has something changed in your model to cause the increase, or is that actually a true change? Which in our world, it's possible. So with things like GTV, or revenue, there's a window where it can change up to 30 days. With our cost data, it tends to change within a 7-day window. But trying to understand how much it's changing is important, because our stakeholders, again, will come to us and say, I ran this report halfway through the month and the cost was X. And now when I've ran it at the end of the month, the cost is Y. What's happened? And before, our, I guess, excuse was, oh, it can change. Sorry. And sometimes also they potentially haven't ran exactly the same report. Maybe they've changed the campaign name or something like that. So it's very hard to validate if there's actually a problem, but you still have to spend time investigating it. So using DBT snapshot feature has been great, because it just allows us to understand the movement over time of our metrics. So an example of this was a stakeholder came to me and said, oh, this brand GTV has reduced significantly over time. I ran the report last week and it was this amount, now it's changed. And then with using snapshots, we could see that actually it had dropped. And then with that, we went back up the chain and then we realized that it was at the source. So we had a conversation with the data engineering team and they just went, yeah, actually, sorry, the first time we ran the data, there was duplicates in it. Now there isn't, so the data is now correct, and I think they forgot to communicate it to us. And then with us sort of having this process in place, it allowed us to have the conversation where now they're much better with communicating changes to the data, and therefore we can proactively again tell our stakeholders that this has changed. So I wanted to sort of highlight our testing framework at Farfetch. So it's again fairly simple, basic, but it works for us. So if I was going to build a new model, I would learn from the previous tests that we've built. So what is in my model and important? GTV, cost, visits, and then I will look at the different tests we've wrote for things like that, and I will inherit it in my model. So every model we have is sort of streamlined with similar tests. And then with that, it's impossible to understand it's impossible to verify every single test and think of everything that can go wrong with your models. So we accept that some things will go wrong, but what we will do in like a retrospective is try to understand if it can happen again. And if it can happen again, we'll write an appropriate test for it. And that gets added to our testing suite. And then thirdly, which I think is super important, is to test your tests regularly. So a test that might be valid last year may not be valid this year. So an example of that is if I wrote a test last year that told me if app revenue was more than 30%, I should investigate there's an issue. That test would not be valid right now because app revenue is approaching more than 50% of our total revenue. So that test would fire saying there's an issue, and potentially someone in the team might start looking into it when there's actually no problem. So it's really important to understand if your tests are passing the test of time. I think that's something that we need to do better in the team, is to constantly just review and prune our tests and make sure that we're not producing any false positives or false negatives. So I wanted to just leave you with some recommendations. So firstly, I think it's important to assess what metrics are important for you as a business. And once that is done, you want to identify, I guess, your source of truth, or identify the chain. And with that, put different tests in different places so you can really hone and pinpoint where there's an issue coming through. So instead of thinking about data tests, you're thinking about more business focused tests. And then secondly, I would like you to validate your data changing on refresh, because this, I feel, is becoming maybe the next problem that crops up most for us. So does your data change? And maybe it's valid, the change, but also I think you want to monitor it, because a 10% change versus a 50% change could mean very different things. And it's just good to understand the movement and also set expectations to your stakeholders that, yeah, costs could move by 20%. And if that is an issue, it's probably up to you to go to your third party to understand why are those changes taking place. And then lastly, just regularly check your tests to ensure that they make sense and they're not producing any false positives or false negatives. And with that, I think that's pretty much 25 minutes. I open the floor to any questions, and I hope it was useful to you. And I'm actually really interested to understand what tests other teams are putting in place, and if there's anything that we've overlooked and we can implement at Farfetch.